Well, again, good morning to you, everyone. So I want to tell you about something that was a fairly regular occurrence in our household for my kids growing up a few years back. They're a little bit older now. As I've shared with you before, I've got a 13-year-old and a 10-year-old. But back, let's rewind maybe about 7 years back or so. And one of the things that was regularly happening was every night, it seemed without fail, for a certain time period, maybe a couple of year window, my children would say, "Hey, Daddy, it's time to wrestle, isn't it?" And they would mean that. It's time to wrestle, right? And see, it started off innocently enough. My daughter, when she was a toddler, probably 3 or 4, I suppose one night in an effort to get a hug from me, came charging at me, wrapped her arms around me, and I made a grunting sound as she made contact with me. And she giggled with delight, and she did it again. She took a running start this time, ran into me, and this time I let her plow me over, pin me to the ground, and made more sounds like, "Oh," which she thought was wonderful. And from there, it just took the form of, I guess you could call it, father-child wrestling. Then when Wes was born and grew up to about that same age a few years later, he was doing the same thing. And now all of a sudden, instead of just being a wrestling thing with Greta and her dad, it became a tag team affair where the two of them would pummel me on a regular basis. And the more I groaned and grunted, the more they giggled with glee. And it was always fun to do. And they appreciated this, and it began to be something, like I said, of a tradition. And they enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. It was snuggling. It was roughhousing a little bit, but it was all seemingly very good. Eleanor, of course, my wife, looked on with sort of amazement, dumbstruck at what she was witnessing, and said, "How is this fun? I don't understand why they're enjoying this, but they're clearly having a blast." And I said, "Well, the crazy thing is I'm enjoying it too." So she did what she often does in those situations. She pulls out her laptop. She begins to Google, why do children enjoy wrestling with their parents? And we found out that this is something, of course, that you may know from your experience too, is very commonplace. Something that you may have as part of your family story as well. But it's apparently very common because what children end up doing is learning about trust. They learn about boundaries, about how far they can push things. They learn about a positive way to get out some of their child aggressions. And they also learn about controlling their feelings. And all of these things are, of course, very positive things. And we saw them grow and develop through, well, wrestling of all things. I bring this up to you because this is a wonderful memory of mine about my children when they were younger that comes to mind every time I read from this passage that I'm about to share with you now. So I'm going to turn with you to the book of Genesis. This is a familiar story to many of you, and for others of you who may be newer to the faith, this is maybe one of the first times that you've heard this story. But it's a story, well, as you'll hear, about a wrestling match. It comes to us from the 32nd chapter of Genesis in the beginning of the Bible, and I'm going to read to you from verses 22 through 32. The same night, he got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, his 11 children, and he crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and set them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go until you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans, and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the hip socket, because he struck Jacob on the hip socket at the thigh muscle. May God add a blessing to this reading. So as I said, story about a wrestling match, but really the setup to the story is kind of important. And just to jog your memory on that, Jacob is brothers with another man named Esau. And these two brothers were born and even wrestling while they were still in the womb. It was kind of a contentious relationship that they had, always in competition with one another, and to make things more complicated, they seemed to be very kind of opposites in terms of personalities. Esau was more of the burly guy, the bigger guy, the hunter, the more athletic. Jacob kind of seemed to like things more along the sensitive side. He was more of a thinker, more introspective, liked helping his mom at home. And so these two brothers lived in tension, and one day Jacob got the idea that he was going to play a trick on his brother, and not just a prank, but the kind of trick that is not easily forgivable, maybe never forgivable. And so he goes to his father, and he dresses and he smells like his brother, and his father is now at a point in an advanced age where he's become senile and he doesn't understand what's going on. And Jacob goes to his father, and he poses as his brother and asks for his father's blessing for his birthright. And what we find out at that point is that his father is actually convinced that he is giving Esau his birthright, and he bestows this blessing upon him. Well, when Esau comes back in from the hunt and he finds that he has been tricked, he vows to kill his brother Jacob. Well, Jacob's mother says to him, "Hey, you better run because your brother is out to get you. Now run off to a faraway place, to a faraway land, and I want you to stay with my brother and his family and hide there until the coast is clear." Well, Jacob does it. He follows his mother's advice. He goes and he lives in a faraway land, and there, over the course of time, many years pass, and he begins to establish a life for himself there. He puts down roots. He marries some women. He grows a family. He raises livestock. He tends to the land, and things seem to be going well, but there is this nagging within him that he feels compelled to go back to his homeland once again. He always feels like he's a bit out of place, an alien in a strange land, and it's time for him to go home again now. But he knows that that means in order to do so, he has to confront Esau. He has to see what things will be like. Will he be warmly received by his brother because a significant amount of time has passed? Will bygones be bygones? Or will he go there and he find that his brother is waiting for him, weapon in hand, ready to seek vengeance on the thing that he stole from him that was so precious to him so many years before? And so we get to this part where the story starts that I just read to you before. Jacob is at the edge of a stream, and on the other side of the stream represents the land. This land where his brother lives, this land where his future should be if he is allowed to enter into it. And so he does this thing which sounds kind of peculiar to us. He says to his wives, to his children, to all of his livestock, he says, "Go to the other side. Go on ahead of me. I'm going to hang back here, and I'll join you tomorrow." Now, this on the surface almost appears as an act of cowardice. Why would he do that? Why would he send them on ahead? Is it just to test the waters? Hey, surely my brother and his people wouldn't kill my wife and my kids, would they? They wouldn't steal all my possessions and my livestock, would they? We don't know. And so at first glance, it seems as though he's sending them over just to maybe see how things are going to go, and he's going to hang back and make sure that the coast is clear. But upon a deeper look, what we find in this story is that maybe there is something that is restless within Jacob, where he says, I need to set aside a bit of time for prayer, for reflection, for contemplation, and I'm going to need this for myself before I can take this great step across the stream and enter into this next phase or next chapter of my life. And so it's there that he has a night where he assumes that he is just going to wrestle with his thoughts, where he's going to consider his next move, what the future will be like. Maybe it's a time of lamenting what has been lost or where he is leaving. Maybe it's a time to dream with excitement about what could be, but certainly there is an anxiety within him that night as he has to deal with the uncertainty of what comes next. But the night, as you heard, does not go exactly how he has planned out. Sometime while after his family has all left him and gone across the other side of the stream, he finds that this stranger comes to wrestle with him. And the text tells us very clearly that this is just not any random stranger. This is not some guy that just stepped out from behind a tree and decides to wrestle with him. We find right away that Jacob understands, and that we as the readers are to understand, that this is God in human form, but God. And what happens is no conversation. It's sparring. It's a wrestling. It's a struggle that takes place. You see, wrestling is what happens in this story, but it's also a metaphor, not just for Jacob, but for us. How many of us, faced with a time of change, uncertainty, struggle, or transition, are we forced to actually wrestle with what it is that we face? One of the things that I really like about this particular story is that it doesn't just gloss over the complicated part to get to the sweet spot. We know that in the future, if we've read ahead in this story, that things are going to get better. That Esau embraces Jacob and they reconcile and they have a future together as a family once again. Now, it's not without its struggles and difficulties, but it's going to get better. But in the moment, we have to do the wrestling. We can't just jump ahead to the pleasant parts. We have to embrace the struggle, no matter how unpleasant or even painful it actually is. And we find ourselves in one of these times now, don't we? I mean, you all can call to mind some of the more difficult parts of your life, for sure. And I wouldn't have to ask you to think very hard to consider some of those. But collectively, we find ourselves in one of those time periods now, a time period where we have to face the uncertainty and the unpredictability of the world around us. We're looking at pandemics. We're looking at social unrest. We're looking at denominational schism. We're looking at, in this church, a change of pastoral leadership. And all of this is complicated. And it's not just going to be a magic wave of the hand and things get better. It's going to require some wrestling. But that's, like I said, what I love about this particular story, is it doesn't shy away from the part that wrestling is what is necessitated in order for change to take place. And what we find is that Jacob wrestles with God. Now, there by the banks of the stream, they are deadlocked and nobody is moving. And now, I don't know about you, but when I've wrestled with friends as a kid or wrestled with my children like I told you about, I mean, that lasts a couple of minutes. Then we get tired and we hug and it's over, right? But this one goes all night. They're locked in together. I imagine hands on each other's shoulders, heads touching one another. And it's in this moment that nothing seems to happen. It's deadlocked. And the sun is about to rise. And the curious thing about that is we've heard elsewhere already in the Bible that anybody who sees God's face will not live to tell about it. And so both Jacob and God know that at the moment that Jacob sees the light shine on God's face, his life will come to an end. And so in this deadlock and in Jacob's stubbornness, he's not letting go. And so it says that God reaches down, strikes a blow into the hip of Jacob. And though he's wounded, he still holds on. And God says, "What is it that you want?" "I want a blessing," says Jacob. "A blessing? What's your name?" "Jacob." "Well, not anymore. Here's your blessing. Your name is now going to be from this day forward Israel. Because Israel means you have wrestled or struggled with God and with humans, and you have prevailed." See, it's not just that it's the wrestling, but it's that there's a blessing that follows. But you don't get to jump ahead to the blessing without doing the wrestling first. And now I would like you to consider in your life some of the things that have been what you would call your trials or your most difficult experiences, the hardships that you have faced. Have they had a sweet thing at the end of them? Was there something that you would call a blessing that followed? Or put a better way, perhaps, think of the greatest blessings in your life. Were they not preceded by a struggle? Now, when I think about people's stories that I know, or I think about my own life, that is certainly the case. Some of the greatest and richest blessings that I have ever experienced started first with a time of struggle or a hard decision that needed to be made. I think about the challenges or the attempts to follow my calling that God has placed on my life. And I think that has sometimes caused us to do things that other people looked on and said, that looks nuts to me. But that led to a blessing. And even though it was hard up front, it led to a blessing. So what were the things in your life? Was it responding affirmatively to a difficult request? Was it having to distance yourself from someone or some people? Losing relationships for the sake of a better future? Was it taking a job opportunity, perhaps, or making a move that you knew was going to be very uncomfortable for you in the meantime, but you hoped that there would be a blessing on the backside? Was it a personal struggle for you, where you knew something about yourself and you had to be true to yourself, but that meant that you might risk creating a chasm between you and others, particularly the people that you loved, in order for you to live your true self and life? Was it a relationship that was toxic or negative that had to come to an end, but that opened the door then for a better relationship, a holy or a godly relationship later on? Was it the struggle of labor and childbirth so that the blessings of a new life and motherhood could follow? When I think about the stories of Jesus and the places that he was ministering to people and encountering them and inviting them into a richer, more fuller life, a life in him, he always made people wrestle first. Not with him, but just with whatever it was, their circumstances. Come and follow me, but in order to do so, you're going to have to put down the nets that you and your father and your father's father and your father's father's father have been carrying for generations. You are going to have to give up the family trade. You are going to have to leave some people who are dependent on you hungry so that you can follow me. It's going to require a sacrifice, but there will be a blessing. Oh, you want to live like my followers do? Well, then you must take all of your possessions and you must sell them and you must give that money to the poor, and then you will be freed up to follow me. You want to follow me? Well, first of all, you have to step down from the pedestal of your power and your authority in order to do so. Wrestling is part of the story. It's not unique to Genesis 32. This is a time-old story that is repeated again and again and again. But the beauty of this and the good news in this is that more often than not, when we struggle through, when we wrestle through the difficult moments, what we find on the flip side is blessing. There is joy there. There is goodness there. And the other good news is that we don't do it alone. So I want to read to you from a commentary that I was reading as I was doing some research for this sermon. Here's what the biblical scholar said. Just as Jacob enters the promised land, God seals the promise with him at just the point where Jacob's life appears most in danger. At the moment of deepest vulnerability for Jacob, God enters into the very depths of the struggle, binding God's own self to Jacob at that level. In fulfillment of the promise, God will go with Jacob into future dangerous moments. God helps to make Jacob ready for the encounter ahead, arming him with continuing blessings for the journey. Jacob can now face any foe, no matter how hostile. Jacob is about to embark on a life and death struggle, and he now knows that God, the wrestler, will be by his side. The greatest blessings are rarely handed to us. They require some sort of a struggle. They require a wrestling, perhaps with others, sometimes a new discovery, a deeper faith, a more lasting faith, because we've wrestled with God. But one thing that we do know is certain, that God, our wrestling partner, will be there with us in lockstep throughout that struggle and throughout the blessings ahead. When I think about wrestling with my children when they were so little, no matter what happened in the wrestling match, no matter who got pinned to the ground first or who won the match, and believe me, I lost my fair share of matches, one of the things that the kids always knew was that their wrestling partner always had their back. That through that wrestling, the trust and the bonding grew. And my prayer for you is that your bond with our Lord Jesus Christ and with God our Creator will be strengthened through the trials that we experience together. That our wrestling partner will never leave us and will always have our back. And that as the story teaches us, and as your story has reminded you time and time again, we will emerge from the struggle to find a blessing. May it be so with you, may it be so with this world, and may it be so with this community of believers.